Welcome to our series on lessons from Exodus. Today is episode 5, which is entitled, Is God Trying to Get Your Attention? We shall be looking at Exodus chapter 3. Moses had been a full-time shepherd now for 40 years. He had been away from Egypt all this time. He had cut off all connections with Egypt and whoever he might have in Egypt. We can say that he has so deeply buried his identity as a prince of Egypt and his calling to be a deliverer for his people of Israel, who, by the way, was still slaving under the oppressive regime of Pharaoh. Things had gotten worse since he left. Midian was not that far from Egypt. It is possible that Moses could have been getting occasional updates about what had been going on in Egypt. Those updates must have bothered him a lot. He might have been telling himself that he was not in a position to do anything about it. By now, he'd convinced himself that he was destined to be a shepherd for the rest of his life. Don't forget the fact that he was now 80 years old. He was no longer young and ambitious. God would have to find some other way to help the people of Israel. God would have to find some other way to help the people of Israel. Surely he must have found someone already prepared to do this job, but it wasn't him, he told himself. He had messed up, he had failed utterly the last time he tried to help. So much time had passed that now he was 80 years old. He was well past the age of active duty. One day, Moses was just doing business as usual. He was feeding his father-in-law's sheep at the backside of the desert near the mountain of God. I don't know if Moses knew that Horeb was a mountain of God. Horeb means desolation. That was not a good name for the mountain of God. But he was drawn to that mountain. The desolation of that mountain seemed to reflect the desolation of his heart. All his dreams about bringing his people out of slavery into freedom were now dead and gone. He really had no purpose for living other than just to keep watching his father-in-law's sheep. Moses had really sunk into a deep depression and was now living a life with no purpose. Contrast that with Jacob. Years ago, Jacob, who was Moses' forefather, also kept his father-in-law's sheep. But Jacob became an entrepreneur. He built up his cattle business on the back of his father-in-law's business. He was so successful that he even got far richer than his father-in-law. Why did Moses not become a ranch owner by now? After 40 years, Moses was still content to serve his father-in-law. He had no ambition to become a rancher like his father-in-law. Did Jethro promise Moses that he would let Moses share part of his inheritance after he died? We don't know. All we know is that after 40 years, Moses was still looking after Jethro's sheep. If Moses had ambition 40 years ago, he would have lost it by now. Moses was once a mighty prince of Egypt. Now he was a shepherd serving under Jethro with no dreams of his own. Horeb must have represented to Moses a mountain of lost dreams, of hope deferred. Now his heart had become sick and calloused. Proverbs 13:12 says, Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. You see, many of you may be in Moses' shoes right now. You had dreams of what you wanted to do for God. You wanted to change the world. You wanted to transform the nations. You wanted to make a real difference, but something happened along the way. People rejected you. People you looked up to did not recognize your calling, your gifts, and your talents. They ignored you. Worse still, they rejected you. You tried so hard, but you failed. In the end, you just gave up. You went back to being ordinary, minding your own business, doing your own thing. You might have even married and have children. Now you're just raising kids, taking care of your family, and trying to save something for your retirement. You don't have a vision for your future any more than just living, just passing time. The fire in your heart is gone. Hope deferred has made your heart sick. It has lost the warmth of life, the care you used to have for the suffering world, and the passion you once had to bring a real change. All that is gone. You were once a prince with God. Now you're just going through the motions, doing the daily grind, just waiting to retire. But what Moses did not know was that God had not forgotten his dreams. Yes, Moses was called to be a deliverer. Yes, he tried and failed miserably 40 years ago. Yes, he fled Egypt and now was a shepherd for 40 years straight. But Moses' dreams were not just Moses' dreams. They were God's dreams. He put them there. And now it was time to resurrect those dreams. Moses' training time was over. During the training, he thought he had lost all hope. He thought he was going to be the shepherd for the rest of his life. In fact, he didn't know he was in training. He was wrong. God was resurrecting his dreams, and he was going to send him back to Egypt to lead the children of Israel out of slavery into the glorious freedom of the people of God. He was going to shepherd them through the same wilderness into the promised land. Moses' dream needed to be activated once again. But what happened to those 40 years in the wilderness when Moses was serving as a shepherd? Was it a wasted time? Not at all. You see, 40 years ago, Moses was naive and immature. Now he had a better sense of reality and had matured. 40 years ago, Moses had his own plans and ideas for the freedom of God's people. Now Moses would have to get instructions from God how to help his people get the freedom that they so desperately need. 40 years ago, Moses was self-reliant. Now Moses would have to be utterly dependent on God. 40 years ago, Moses was just a natural man with charisma. Now Moses had died to his own natural man and would rely on the supernatural power of God. 40 years ago, Moses was ignorant of the spiritual reality in Egypt. Now Moses would be empowered to employ the power of God against the gods of Egypt, who kept the people of Israel in slavery. 40 years ago, Moses' knowledge of God was secondhand. Now Moses would know God personally, which was going to be the key to the success for the next phase of his life. From now on, Moses' relationship with God would be of paramount importance to his success in seeing his dreams fulfilled. Everything he did from now on would be hinged on his personal relationship with God. His ability to see, hear, discern God's voice and directions would determine if Moses was going to be successful or not in his mission. How does God go about activating and resurrecting Moses' dreams? Let's read Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. So we see that God used a natural phenomenon that had a supernatural twist to get Moses' attention. A bush burning in the desert was not extraordinary. In a dry and desert land, that happened occasionally. But a burning bush that does not get consumed by fire, that was supernatural. Moses became curious and went to see what was causing a burning bush not to burn up. When God saw Moses turn aside to look, he called to him. Now the term the angel of the Lord, many people believe, represents the pre-incarnate Christ. That is how Jesus would appear in the Old Testament age before he became human. So the angel of the Lord called out to Moses and asked him to take his shoes off, because where he stood had just become a holy ground. Are there places in your life where you have had a history of meeting with God? Have you been feeling drawn to go back there lately? It could be that God is trying to get your attention. He is trying to tell you that He has not forgotten you. He cares about the desires of your heart. He wants to resurrect your dreams, His dreams, that He planted in you when you were very young. God likes using signs to direct you to a place of encounter with Him. Those signs often look like something ordinary, but there's something not so ordinary about those ordinary events. Perhaps you have been feeling very discontent lately about the nature of your relationship with God. Perhaps you don't feel that the work you've been doing satisfies you anymore. Perhaps the people who used to like hanging out with you don't seem to be keen to meet with you now. Perhaps the church you've been attending for years is now feeling sterile and without any spiritual life. I don't know what signs God is using with you. All I know that He knows how to get your attention. Just pay attention to His signs, and you will find your way back to your dreams. This will be your homework. Find your way back to the heart of God and rediscover your purpose. And I shall see you next time. God bless you.